But will it work? Will a positive campaign message appeal to an electorate that is decidedly sour about the country's direction? Joining us now to break it all down is presidential historian and author Rubino. Rich, always good to see you. Thank you for joining us, and good morning to you. So a recent Associated Press NORC poll found that roughly 70% of Americans think the country is headed in the wrong direction. So how will a positive campaign, this joyful warrior campaign, play in that negative atmosphere?
Well, I think the precedent for that would have been Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. The country was in the midst of the Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt proposed a New Deal and actually got elected in 1932. Now, the opposite of that would probably be 1968. And this is very interesting and instructive because Hubert Humphrey, the fellow Minnesotan of Tim Walz, ran a campaign. He ran on the politics of joy. He was a happy warrior. He used to say, "I'm pleased as punch." The problem was 1968, the country was enveloped in racial riots in the Vietnam War, and Humphrey's administration, he was part of the Johnson administration, was exceedingly unpopular, and consequently America wanted to change. They went to Richard Nixon. The other example that I can think of would be 1988. Michael Dukakis that year was exceedingly popular, at least in the summer of 1988. He had a 17-point lead over George H.W. Bush, but Michael Dukakis did not fight back when George H.W. Bush and his campaign surrogates went after Dukakis. Consequently, he ended up losing by 10 points. You can kind of see either way. But generally, when the country is in gloomy times, you can either have a positive person like Franklin Roosevelt who actually won, or you can have somebody who tried to run a positive campaign like Hubert Humphrey in 1968 and tried to stay above the fray like Michael Dukakis in 1988, and both of them ended up losing the elections.
And it also goes back to, I just think, some axioms of American politics, and they tend to be that, one, elections are about the future, and people will respond more sometimes to positivity than negative. And let's face it, she's also getting advice from Obama, reportedly, who, of course, was about hope and change. And now she has a message of freedom and a Beyonce song, and so she's going on that. And then Governor Walz is a kind of an affable grandpa-like figure, and he's giving more of that energy here. But also, it seems like we're still in the honeymoon phase. So much has changed about this race. There's a slog to November. This thing could get ugly because it's politics and it's an election year and it's the presidency. Do you think it endures? How long can one stay joyful in modern American politics, do you think? Running against Trump, who you know is going to come out swinging hard.
Usually, it's just the honeymoon period of the candidate, and certainly when Vice President Harris announced Governor Tim Walz as his vice presidential running mate. Very positive campaign, speaking to tens of thousands, 10,000 people at one point. Very interesting. But generally speaking, if you get into the general election campaigns, you get in the weeds, both candidates really kind of go after each other. Usually it happens. Usually you start off by going informative. You try to inform the American people who the candidate is. You try to find who the candidate is. In this case, Vice President Harris was trying to find, Governor Harris, you're trying to find him as somebody who's a veteran, who's a football coach, who represented a relatively somewhat conservative congressional district in Minnesota, someone who had been reelected, someone who signed paid and medical leave in Minnesota, whereas the Republicans were trying to define him in a different way. They're trying to find him as a radical liberal, somebody to that effect. So they go through a defining campaign. Then you usually go through a positive part of the campaign where you try to effectuate a narrative of a positive campaign of what's going to happen when your candidate gets elected. Then, usually, despite what you may have said previously, toward the end of the campaign, you go extremely negative on each other, and that's what turns off a lot of voters. But you're trying to bring in as many low-propensity voters as possible, in part, from beginning with hope, but then you usually land up in part running against the other person because of fear.
And it seemed like along those same notes, that same note there, that fear was a huge part of President Biden's campaign, and that's what turned off a lot of people when it came to that, because it was always democracy is at stake, which felt very heavy to voters who were watching and listening to what he was saying at rallies. And this is obviously very different. It's more of a lighter tone. It's more freedom, and this is what you can expect moving forward. One thing that when we did interviews about Minnesota Governor Tim Walz was that he's that bulldog, that he is the likable uncle at the barbecue in the neighborhood, but he's willing to go on the attack as well. The barbs that we've seen him kind of throw at J.D. Vance and former President Trump, Do voters need to see more of that, or would they be more turned off to it if they see that from maybe a Vice President Harris and not just from him?
I think outwardly they would say they're being turned off by that. If you were to ask them, they would say something to the effect of stick on the issues. But it can't. If it's staying to the issues and running positive campaigns, it's the only thing that worked. That's the only thing campaigns would be. That's the only way campaigns would be employed. It would all be positive campaigns, but it's not. In part because I think that it gets into your inner psyche and you start to fear the other candidate. And I go back to 1988, where Michael Dukakis, George H.W. Bush that year, they really put a lot of fear into the American people that Michael Dukakis was a Massachusetts liberal, that he had raised taxes, that he was against the Pledge of Allegiance. You had the Willie Horton ads, for example, and consequently, George H.W. Bush turned a 17-point deficit into a 10-point landslide within a 3-month period of time. So negative campaign, it really does work, even though voters might say that how disgusted they are and really excoriate it. In reality, it does have an actual effect, and that effect, I guess, is it's negative toward the opponent as opposed to being positive toward one candidate.
It is an amazing dynamic. I think human nature is we do drift toward the negative a little bit. If you pass a wreck on the highway, we all look, even though you know it's not going to be a good scene. Fascinating reporting in the last couple of days from the New York Times. And the headline was this: inside the worst 3 weeks of Donald Trump's 2024 campaign, people around the former and would-be president see a candidate knocked off his bearings, disoriented by his new contest with Kamala Harris, and unsure of how to take her on. And I thought it was kind of a behind-the-scenes look at the last few weeks, basically since Biden dropped out. So this message, whatever the motivations are, however long it lasts, it does seem that Donald Trump, unlike the past, is having a hard time landing a punch because this is all so new, so sudden, and so different. And maybe it's a tough adjustment inside that campaign. Do you see it the same way? And can he course correct, perhaps?
Yes, I do. It's really a tabula rasa, if you will. It's a blank slate, if you will. He no longer can run against an incumbent president. Now, he can try to tie Vice President Harris to Joe Biden. Joe Biden, who's currently underwater, has about a 43% job approval rating. He can try to kind of tether or alligate the two together. But the bottom line is that Vice President Harris is a different person than Joe Biden. You do not have the age issue. The American people do not, whether they like her or not, they do not necessarily see her as incompetent, whereas some saw Joe Biden that way, in part because of his age, in part because of his debate performance. So it really is a blank slate on the part of the former president in terms of how to define this ticket. What they're trying to do, and you've heard this on this Elon Musk interview, he's trying to define Vice President Harris as a quote-unquote San Francisco liberal. Now, what does that mean? Well, back in 1984, the Democrats held their convention in San Francisco and nominated arguably the most liberal ticket in American history, at least since Roosevelt and Wallace in 1940. They nominated Walter Mondale for president and Jolly for vice president, and Gene Kirkpatrick, a former Democrat who became the UN ambassador to during the Reagan administration, defined the Democratic Party as quote-unquote San Francisco liberals. You're seeing Donald Trump try to do that. There's a negative connotation the American people seem to have with the city of San Francisco, that San Francisco is too liberal. I think you're going to see her try to tether Vice President Harris with somebody like Nancy Pelosi, who represents San Francisco in the United States Congress. And that seems to be the message that he's running against her, that he did not run against Joe Biden.
And listen, Chicago, I would assume you would agree, just in 30 seconds here, is essentially, there's a lot of hype, a lot of social media, a lot of talk, a lot of momentum, but eventually we do need to get down to some substance.
Right.
What do you stand for? What are you about? What policies will you fight for? Forget persona, I'm talking about policy. Is Chicago the best chance that Harris will have to literally introduce or reintroduce herself to the country from a substantive point of view beyond the Beyonce song?
Yes, yes, absolutely. This is a time, remember, a lot of people are really not that interested in politics. They have their own lives. They're low propensity voters. But since it's on every channel, they're kind of almost captive that they have to watch it. So this is where she gets to define herself. And that is why after conventions, there's about at least a 5 or 6 point bounce that the candidates get. I think Donald Trump is probably trepidatious about the kind of a bounce that Vice President Harris will get. And the question is, after she gets that bounce, in part by talking about policy, in part by just defining herself, can Donald Trump cut into that the way that George H.W. Bush did to Mike Dukakis in 1988 and try to redefine her? Politics is all about messaging, and it's all about defining your candidate in a positive way and about defining your opponent in a negative way.
All right, Rich Rubino, presidential historian and author. As always, thank you for your time and your insight. We appreciate it.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
All right, coming up in our next